Today, my guest and I destroy misconceptions about world building.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I know I kind of say this every time, but I have an incredible interview this week. It is in-depth, it is challenging, it is thought-provoking, so I am not going to waste any more time. Here it is. My guest today is Transmedia author and longtime role player, Houston Howard. Houston, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Super excited to be here.
Absolutely. It is so glad to have you back on the show. Our last conversation was awesome. It was like an hour and a half long, I think.
Yeah.
We covered tons of topics from your role-playing history to the future of storytelling. And I think there was a big Star Wars rant in the middle,
Yep.
all kinds of stuff that people can check out. I will try to put the link to our first conversation in the show notes for this episode so people can check out that first episode as well. A lot of interesting stuff, a lot of history about your role playing, and
Sure.
And a lot of stuff that would be interesting to a lot of people. So, but today we're going to focus on another aspect of some of the work that you do. And I want to ask you about that because we're going to talk about world building. Now, you teach world building, isn't that right?
I do. I'm a professor at two different universities, the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California, and then the Los Angeles Film School, which is right in the smack dab middle of Hollywood. So teach world building classes there. Then I also do a lot of writing about world building in my latest book. You're going to need a bigger story. There's a heavy world building component tucked in there, but then also working on a new dedicated book just to world building because it's emerged as such a big topic in the entertainment space, especially getting into things like the metaverse and things like that. Everybody's trying to figure out world building. So I do a lot of professional consultation and professional work on the world building space. And so, I learned most of my world building wisdom from role playing games. And so I'm able to kind of port that over, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is great training. So now your context, you did mention the metaverse and stuff there, but are you mainly from like a filmmaking and television kind of aspect that you're usually dealing with?
Typically, I started in dedicated film and television, but then over the past several years have now diversified into video game space and comic books and working with authors in the novel space and publishing space, and then in the NFT space and sort of the Web3 stuff that's popping right now. And so, whereas I started film and television, I've been able to kind of create a nice little mosaic because now going, with the transmedia aspect we talked about last time, there's so much convergence between all these different sectors and parts of the entertainment industry. Now you can take a skill set like mine and be able to apply it to IP as a whole, and then prep the intellectual property to be able to navigate all those different sectors because now things are just converging so fast. It's crazy.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, and there's a lot there. So that is really awesome, really interesting work as well. And as you mentioned, I think probably the greatest qualification in the world would be tabletop role-playing games to really cut your teeth and get some of that world building experience in. So that is awesome. So I definitely want to talk about how your role-playing game experience then does inform your world building when you teach your students. But I think first off, I want to ask you, what are some misconceptions about world building when some students or, maybe it even is an author or somebody reaches out to you and they say something about world building? What are some of the misconceptions about world building that you hear pretty often?
So the big misconception, I think, is that the world building is genre specific, that world building is only for fantasy or sci-fi worlds, and that's it. And that if you're operating in the quote unquote real world, or something other than some Tolkien-esque type of a setting, you don't really need to do the world building rubric and world building work that really would make the IP better if you did. So so a lot of times, my whenever I start to work with a studio or a production company or an author or something like that, it's educating on how things like John Wick, for example, there's the same world building that takes place in Middle Earth is applied to something like John Wick. There's culture and currency and social norms and character groups and all these different things that you can identify in Game of Thrones, you can identify in Middle Earth, and you can identify in Harry Potter, that have been ported over into a more of a real world setting. There's a great show that was on recently on Apple TV that I highly recommend is a show called Severance. And it is set it's a workplace mystery set in the modern day real world, but has tremendous world building that goes into it. And those principles that Severance uses in its workplace mystery are the same that Tolkien used as he was crafting the world that we know, and C.S. Lewis and all the great world builders that we know. So that's the big misconception of like, oh, I'm just doing I'm just working on a detective thriller set in Los Angeles. I don't really need to approach it from a world building perspective, and I'm in a near future small town or whatever. It's the same thing. Like the same questions apply. They're contextualized a little bit different, and they are expressed maybe a little bit differently. But ultimately, world building is not genre specific at all.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that is an interesting point because, like to continue some piece of your example, you say you're doing a detective thriller in Los Angeles modern day, but in your novel, if you say the mayor of Los Angeles is a man named Darren Strickland or something, you've just created a whole new world, right?
Sure, absolutely, right. You immediately sort of deviate, and even if you are operating in the actual real world. So let's say you're a documentarian or you're a journalist that's crafting a story for a website or newspaper, and you can examine that real world through the lens of Tolkien-esque world building and really build that world out. Typically, what I say as my rule of thumb is you want to ask yourself, is it possible to remove your main character from your story world and still have something interesting remaining? And if so, then, you have a pretty good start on the story world. And let's examine the world itself in a way that is almost like the world is its own character. And every character should be interesting in any story. And so we have to make sure that world is interesting. So, is it possible to remove Batman from Batman and still have something interesting? Of course, because then you have Gotham City and there's a whole TV show just about Gotham without Batman. Is it possible to remove Frodo from Middle Earth? Absolutely. Can you remove, Jon Snow from Game of Thrones and Westeros and still have something interesting? Absolutely. Can you remove Dorothy from Oz and still have something interesting? Absolutely. And so that goes to show that, okay, there's something interesting left to explore. And now we just have to figure out how to define it. But, if you're working on a documentary of a small town or say Los Angeles, and you're doing a documentary about a certain person who lived in a certain part of town, remove that person from that world and then just examine the world that's left. And odds are you're going to find some really interesting nuances and angles and perspectives that you didn't see before because you were looking at it through just the lens of one story, just the lens of through a single character. But when you examine the world by itself, I think it presents a lot of new opportunities, even when it's completely 100% real world based.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we touched on that a little last time in our first interview. And I think that is a great way to look at things, that, you know, the idea that if you can remove your main character and you still have a viable story world. And I think we're seeing that now. I mean, we're getting kind of a wave of licensed properties that are coming out in tabletop role-playing games. We're getting, you know, the Blade Runner role-playing game. Well, of course, if you remove the main character from Blade Runner, you have an amazing story world that you can have a lot of stories in conflict in. We're getting a G.I. Joe role-playing game I just saw the other day, right? Based on the old cartoon from the 80s. Well, of course, you can create other characters than Duke and Scarlet and whatever. You can create other characters and have that. And I think you can see that in other worlds too. There's a new game it has licensed Highlander, right? Well, I mean, you can, oh my gosh, talk about, having an interesting concept with, a story world of the concept of immortals and that. I mean, talk about an amazing story world there. And so I think people are starting to realize that, even though, years back, it's like, where's the Tron role-playing game? Because that's amazing, right? Or whatever. So I do think that is an interesting way to look at things. And in that regard, I think you can definitely see certain movies or certain novels or, certain TV shows where you're like, I just want to be in this world, right? Like it would be just awesome to be in this world. And I think that is a really interesting clue about world building, that when, you're going to create this world that is like so interesting that it doesn't matter, really who the main character is in some sense. And I think that's interesting.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think what we look at is in especially a transmedia multi-platform perspective is I'm completely convinced that the revenue potential of your brand and of your IP is dictated by how optimized and effective and built out is your story world. I think the shelf life of IP comes from story world, not just a singular character. Now, you do have some exceptions to that. Something like Sherlock Holmes and James Bond, where you can just continue to kind of rehash those characters over time. But those are few and far between, and that's really difficult to do, especially in today's market. When we were launching those characters a zillion years ago, they're a little bit different. But today, if you do want to be able to exploit IP across different platforms, your story world has to be good. Else, you're just going to be stuck with a prequel sequel of a character, and you're only going to be able to go so far with that. You have to be able to kind of build out beyond that character, that central character, those central characters, and spread your wings in a maybe different way. And that only comes from a good story world. So it has a lot of creative wisdom behind building your story world. There's also a big business reason why you need to operate and optimize that story world, because it really drives the IP moving forward.
Yeah. But I think, and I absolutely totally agree. I think if you have that story world there, then that could lend to, your novel could become a video game, your movie could become a TV show. We saw that with Stargate, right? I mean, the 1994 movie, set up a fantastic premise that became an amazing show in Stargate SG-1. So I think we see that. I think, though, there could be a fallback here, though, because I think, especially coming from the role-playing game side, I know years ago when I would write short stories and send them out to magazines and get them all rejected. This was some decades back, and I'm sure they were all terrible. Some of the feedback I got is that, I've created a world, but nobody knows who my character is. And I think that might have been because I was used to creating worlds that my friends would role play in. And so that kind of created a problem. Do you see that sometimes too? Like you made a dynamic world, but there is no story to hang that novel or that TV show on.
100%. I mean, this is what makes it hard, because ultimately, I think you need to have a good story world in entertainment, whether it's a role playing game or a movie or a TV show or anything in between. You have to have a good world, especially if you want to exploit it across platform. But you absolutely 100% have to have a great story that goes along with that. I think that if you had to choose between the two, you should probably opt for the great story over the great story world, simply because that will at least give you a good product. But if you have, if you have a great story and not a great story world, you could still win an Oscar and make $1 zillion. But if you have a great world and you don't have a great story, there's no product. Maybe you get the RPG source book out of it, but there's no product. Because every entertainment is based on stories, and so but they're different skill sets. World building is a very different skill set than storytelling, and some of the best storytellers that I know just can't world build to save their lives. Some of the greatest world builders that I know really, really struggle with narrative, and that's okay. Sometimes that means these people just need to find collaborative partners to work together, and you build the world and I tell the story, and we work together and take over the world. But just because you're a great world builder doesn't mean those stories are going to come naturally. We saw. After the Wachowskis did such a great job at The Matrix and created such a great world with such a great story, they followed that up with Jupiter Ascending. And Jupiter Ascending, I don't know if you saw it, Matt, but it was, did you see it?
I have not, sadly.
Okay. I would just avoid that altogether, unless you want a good case study maybe. Yeah. But it's a really super interesting world. I mean, the Wachowskis really, really understand world building, but then it's just a terrible movie. And when the story sucks, but the world is great, the story will pull the whole thing down, and that's a shame. But unless you're George Lucas and you have 30 years of brand equity in Star Wars, because I think the prequels weren't great stories, but that world has been established so long. Outside of that, if you're trying to launch a new property, if you have a bad story that is saddled to a great world, it's just all going to go down. But the inverse could actually work with a not a great world, but a great story. All of a sudden, that could work in a more of a limited capacity. So, but I think you saw Tomorrowland with George Clooney, right? Tremendous world, but just not a great film. And we've read books that aren't great, and played video games that don't have great stories, but they have a cool world. But it's just really, you have to be able to execute on a narrative level in order to make that world sing. If you don't, it doesn't mean your world is bad. It just means you got to punch up that narrative in order to sell the product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, obviously your Star Wars example, it's just that, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Princess Leia, Chewie are so cool that we hung in there, and then we learned about the world, and then it's like, I want to be in that world, right? But if they wouldn't have carried us on, in 77, if that wouldn't have carried, the world may have been the same, but we wouldn't have stuck around to see the world being, built around it or whatever.
You're one. The protagonist, the POV character, is our window into that world, and so the world of Hunger Games is a great world, but if we don't care about Katniss, and if she's not our window, mm-hmm. and we're rooting for her as that window, it just doesn't work. Same with Harry Potter and Jon Snow and everybody else. Like, you have to have that story that attaches emotionally to lead us into that story. And then once we're there, then there's the opportunity to explore. But you have to have that window as an entry point for sure.
Yeah. And then I guess the counterpoint would be some of the video game movie adaptions where the world was fun, but where we realized that the main story was hinged on a person with a controller, not the character as written. And so you might be left with a good world, but there's nothing to hang that movie on because there's not somebody there with a controller, right?
Well, I think that the Halo series is experiencing that right now, and that it's not, it hasn't been easy translating Master Chief to screen, and especially as is, and they actually had to break away their continuity from the games just to be able to get into a space where they could actually tell a TV show. But then it just doesn't feel like Master Chief anymore. And the fact that he's taken off his helmet in the first episode, spoiler alert, like things like that, like you're like, well, he's doing stuff that Master Chief didn't do in the video games, and there's a weird disconnect, and it's a struggle. It's hard, especially when you launch as game. What's going to be interesting is, I think, when The Last of Us hits with HBO, how that then is received. But I anticipate it to be received well, because that's a little bit more, or a lot more, narratively driven than something like Halo. But it's always tough to launch a world and a story in video game and then translate it into some other things, because in video games, players have agency, and they're used to being Master Chief. And then all of a sudden, when you can't control Master Chief anymore, it's just a very different experience. But if you look at something like Cyberpunk 2077, they really went world first with that. They just thought let's just trick out this world in this incredible, amazing way. And they did, and it's awesome. But then they fumbled the product, and the product was buggy and glitchy and not a great story. And so, I think they lost a lot of momentum just because they really, they were focused more on the world than they were on the story. But I'm a fan of that world. We'll see where that goes. But I've been a big fan of Elden Ring in the video game space, and I just kind of like ride my ghost horse around, just looking around at the world. That's not even, I haven't even like accomplished a quarter of what I'm supposed to accomplish in the game. It's just absolutely such an incredible world. You just want to, I don't know if I want to actually visit there, because every single thing wants to murder you, but it's cool to be able to play in that sandbox just as a fan. It's super cool.
Yeah. And that's the same for Cyberpunk 2077. You're like, oh, this looks great. And I'd like to play a game in it, but I don't want to live right here.
Never. Absolutely right.
Yeah. And that's it. I think all of that stuff is very interesting, and it is interesting to see where people go with different things, because how the story driven property with the great world can expand into like everything, like you were mentioning, right? There can be Star Wars comic books, video games, movies, TV shows, whatever. There can be anything. Star Trek, same way, right? There can be a Star Trek anything. You can have a Star Trek whatever. And then some stories are more limited. But yeah, it is interesting, because I guess the video game creators, right? They're struggling. They have a $1 billion property, and they can't figure out how to get it to translate to some other medias. Whereas you would think Halo, I don't know if there is one, but I don't think there's a tabletop role-playing game of Halo. They should do that, because you don't need a main character, right?
Absolutely right.
One of your people will be will be Master Chief, or
sure.
Obviously Cyberpunk 77 is based on a role-playing game, but my problem, because I played a bit of Cyberpunk 2077, and just all my sadness, I guess, because I'm just trained on tabletop role-playing games, is just that when I walk up to a door, I'd like to be able to walk into any door, but I get the limitations of the technology, but I still, because if I was playing a tabletop role-playing game, I could just say, oh, I walk into that store, and in the game you can't. Sure. But we're always faced with that. But I guess that's what the metaverse and some other things are going to try to solve, is that where's the Cyberpunk 2077 where I can just walk into any door in.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
The metaverse is really, presenting this interesting dilemma and conundrum for creators, because now you have this concept of I have a great story, and I have a great brand, and I have, et cetera, et cetera. But then people will want to just go into the world without experiencing the story. They want to be a participant, almost in a LARP, right? They just want to walk around like Galaxy's Edge at Disney World. I just want to be able to walk around this place, and people are realizing very quickly that, wait a minute, if you're not following my character and not following my story, everything that I have left over isn't that exciting for you to explore. And so now they're trying to retrofit a lot of world building on top of some established story. And that's always a little wonky. The Lego blocks don't always fit as well as you want them to. But the metaverse, man, it is presenting, it's really super fueling a world building conversation in the industry in a big way, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure of my feelings on the whole concept, but I see where things are going. So it is quite interesting. And just to get us back to, so, we've talked about some of the misconceptions about world building and some of the pitfalls of, that you've got to have this dynamic between a good world and a good story. If you want a property to really kind of launch out there. But just bringing it back to when you were teaching a class, what are some of the intro kind of steps that you introduce to some people? Now, I know people who listen to this podcast have been role playing probably for a long time. And so they're probably familiar, but I'm sure you kind of maybe make it a system or put names on it that maybe we don't have names for, when we come to,
It's interesting because I love talking. When I go out to film and television people and production companies, a lot of times world building is very new to them because they've been staff writers on workplace comedies, and now they're on a TV show where there's a world there and they don't know how to approach it, and so there's a lot of real super basic education you have to do with the students and also professionals. When I'm in, role playing circles, you don't have that problem because they're all so well versed in the world building and what it takes to have a good world. But I think that also is a trap in and of itself. You get so comfortable and so used to world building in a very specific way that every time you go and homebrew your own game and homebrew your own world, it becomes such muscle memory that you stop growing. It's like, if you when you first start going to the gym and you do certain exercises, you feel sore afterwards because it's uncomfortable and you're really pushing yourself. But if you just do those same exercises every single day, every single time you go to the gym, eventually you're not going to be sore anymore, which means you're not really growing your muscles anymore. And so a lot of times when I talk to fantasy authors or RPG folks, it's trying to rekindle or re-lens the whole world building discussion, because ultimately a good world and good world building is not just a cool map with cool monsters. And I think that's, typically kind of what I get when I talk to folks that have RPG experience. They can homebrew a really cool map with interesting locations that have really cool monsters. And but that in and of itself doesn't create a great world. And so I kind of have to dial back. Now, those are very cool elements of a good story world. You need a cool map. You need not necessarily monsters, but you need, some sort of, antagonistic force within that world and obstacles. But a lot of times I'll take people back to some fundamental questions when it comes to world building, especially when you're trying to push it into larger entertainment space. The first question I always ask them is what do you want to say with your world? What's that thematic, that what I call a soapbox, but like, what's your perspective that you want to embed into this world so that when people experience this world, that message and that perspective and that thematic is going to come through. And it's a very broad question that usually people don't think as a world building question because they want to open up World Anvil and start map making and get into the cartography of it. But really, I think there's a fundamental question to ask yourself first, because if you study great world builders, which I've tried to study as many great world builders as I can, from Neil Gaiman to Hideo Kojima to George Lucas, et cetera, they all start the world building process with perspective and what they want to say about the world. So when you go and talk, and you can pull up interviews of George Lucas when people ask him, why did you create Star Wars? And where does your ideas come from, and et cetera. And he'll talk about Buck Rogers and stuff a little bit, but really he quickly pivots into political conversation and talks about the danger of overreaching government and the moral responsibility for regular people to rise up and push back against overreaching government. And he starts talking about Vietnam and the Nixon administration, and all of a sudden George Lucas goes into a 45-minute conversation just about politics and how democracy dies, and how bureaucracy will eat politics in a really bad way, and everything about Star Wars is inspired by George Lucas's view on politics. Like, he's saying something very specific with the world of Star Wars, and that specific thing that he's saying is embedded and comes from the authentic political commentary that he has as a person. He was a college student during the Vietnam era and during the Vietnam War, and he had ideas and thoughts about that. Right, Frank Herbert. When you listen to Frank Herbert about how he created Dune, there was a lot of ecological talk about the coastlines and how the coastlines were being swept away, and literally the dunes were keeping the coastline from sweeping away, and he had another environmental message that was embedded in there. That was really interesting. That came from his heart. It's really interesting when you go back and listen to Frank Herbert talk about Dune. He rarely talks about Dune. He talks about like all his perspective about the world. The same. When you look at a world like the A Handmaid's Tale, which is it's a crazy story world and impactful story world, that is embedded with commentary of the creator. And so what I always like to do first is like, okay, what do you as a creator like to say? Like what does your world say? When you experience the story world of Jurassic Park, it says something very specific. It says, don't play God, because every time people try to play God, we screw it up and make everything worse. Right. That's that. And that, never ever in the Jurassic Park world does anybody ever say, "Oh man, thank God we made those dinosaurs." It's just like, it's always just like you feel the message, even though it's never said. It's woven in the DNA. And so I think first, like even when you're home brewing your own game, I think to take the time to say, what do I think about life and culture, and or whatever? Like, what it could be political commentary, it could be religious commentary, it could be social commentary, it could be it could be a variety of different things. And I knew a lady who was so passionate about giraffes, like African giraffes, and about like that was she could talk hours about African giraffes and how the giraffe population was depleting, and how terrible people, big game hunters, go and shoot them and post pictures on Facebook. And I helped her actually craft this really super interesting world that she ended up turning into a book that was inspired based on that message. It was a fantasy world that didn't have giraffes, but there was an equivalent there that was embedded into that DNA. And so even from something like giraffes to political commentary, whatever it is, start there, figure that out, what you want to say. And then here's the trick. You want to flip it. You want to flip your world concept to be a world that needs that message. So what I mean by that, Matt, is this: is if let's say your message is you want to have a thematic about racism, and racism is evil and needs to be eradicated from the planet, right? Let's say that's your thematic, that's your soapbox, that's the thing you want to communicate. What you don't want to do is create a world where there is no racism. That would be terrible. Not a terrible, ideally in our world, that would not be terrible. That would be ideal. But in an entertainment property, that's not a good place to world build, because when you create the reflection of your message or your soapbox, what you've done is you've removed conflict. And there's nothing for your characters to do because you've created a utopia, and utopias just don't work. The only time utopias actually work in entertainment is when they're not actually utopias. They're actually dystopias, but no one knows it. And you have to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit and kind of see the dirty stuff going on in the background. But you have to create a world with conflict. And so if your thematic is all about I'm going to create a world where I'm going to show that, how important the environment is and how we need to take care of the earth, then your world needs to be a world where people aren't taking care of the earth and screwing the environment up. Because now when you put your characters in that world, whether role-playing characters or whether characters that you create and are doing in your novel or any other entertainment property, now they're going to have conflict in that world because they're now trying to live out that message and are going to be met with resistance. And so the first step is figure out what you want to say and then flip that into a world that needs that message. And all of a sudden you have a really cool starting point where you have natural conflict. If you look at the world of A Handmaid's Tale, the theme and the thematic of the soapbox of A Handmaid's Tale is the government shouldn't have anything to do with the reproductive rights of women. And so the world of A Handmaid's Tale is exactly the opposite. It's where the government has everything to do with the reproductive rights of women and control the whole thing. And so now you thus then have the conflict. And so that's just an initial trick to get you to a starting point. But when you do that, you weave that thematic into the DNA of the world, and it's always going to emotionally connect with the players or the readers or the audience in a whole different way, rather than just starting with the cool map, right? It starts at a deeper place, which is, if you look at the great world builders over time, the story worlds that have really stood the test of time are the ones that are kind of woven in with perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you covered a lot of ground there, and I think you can see that with certain properties, especially Star Wars, that say, of course, the first time I saw Star Wars, I had no idea he was talking about Vietnam or any kind of political anything, other than the base oppression of the evil empire or whatever.
Sure.
But I do think, I think you're absolutely right that properties that have a foundation like that, and it almost even goes to the point to where whether you agree with it, whether you don't agree with it, or whether it's even true or not true, sometimes those just having that initial premise just lends weight to the property, right? It just lends an extra
100%.
Level to it that you may not even realize. I think taking a movie, say like Escape from New York, I did an episode a while back with John Walsh, who wrote a big book on the making of Escape from New York, right? Of course, John Carpenter put a lot of political thought in there. But, when I was younger and I saw Escape from New York, none of that registered to me really until I was older and able to process some of what John Carpenter was talking about. But it lended such a weight to the world, and it made the world feel so real that, when I was watching it when I was like 16 or something, it didn't matter, right? It just didn't even matter. Absolutely. But it gave the world so much weight that there was something other than, say, you can't even think of the name, right? Say some soulless action movie that I watched around the same time that I rented, and I don't even remember what the name of it is, right? Because Escape from New York had something behind it, and you could say, do I agree? Do I disagree? Is it true? Is it untrue? It doesn't even matter almost. It's just like it had an extra layer in there that gave it some weight. That's what you're talking about too, right?
100%, because I think we can all agree that there, like when you're experiencing a story, whether it's a game or whether it's a movie, that there's a real thin line where you can cross over and become super preachy, and that kind of pulls people out of the story, and it gets heavy-handed really, really easily. This is what's so good about embedding the world with the message, because when the world's embedded with the message, your stories don't have to be burdened with the responsibility of carrying the message. Your stories can be about anything that you want, but you still get the message intrinsically, even though it's unspoken. You look at something like WALL-E, the Pixar film. I think the commentary, the thematic that really drives WALL-E is an environmental message. It's, don't screw up the planet. Don't turn Earth into a trash heap. And that's the big takeaway from WALL-E. But what's so interesting about that is if you look at the story of WALL-E, not just the world, the story of WALL-E. The story of WALL-E has a completely different message. It's not contradictory, but it's a love story. It's about the junky robot who falls in love with the super hot new robot, and she's out of his league and he's still going after her. And that message from that story isn't necessarily an environmental message at all. It's don't let the world tell you who you can love, and go after your soulmate, even if the world says otherwise, which is not an environmental message at all. But we still get the environmental message from WALL-E because it's woven into the DNA of the world, which then liberates the individual story from having to preach and hit you over the head with. Right? It's just it becomes and what it does is the reason it lends more weight to the world itself, even if you disagree with it, or even if you never pick up on it, is because the creators will connect with the story better as they're creating it, because there's going to be a fire in their belly. There's going to be an emotional connection that they have that's meaningful to them. And I think a non-Christian can watch the Chronicles of Narnia and read the Chronicles of Narnia and not subscribe to Judeo-Christian belief systems and still get the depth and intricacies of the world and still enjoy that world without necessarily converting to Christianity, even though C.S. Lewis approached that world in that religious paradigm as he was creating that world. But what that does is, even though it doesn't necessarily, the audience may not agree with it or may not even pick up on it, it allows the creator to just invest even deeper into the creation of the world. And world building is so hard that if you don't have a fire in your belly, you probably will give up about halfway through, because there's a lot of granular things, if you do it right, that you have to do that most people don't do. It take a long time, and et cetera, et cetera. Tolkien is famous for taking 17 years to create Middle Earth before he ever released something. I mean, but you have to have a fire in your belly to be able to see that world building through, to ultimately really, release it and realize it in some form. And in order for that creator to get that fire in the belly, they have to be emotionally connected to it. It has to be authentic from their heart. And when they approach world building with an authenticity, then there's going to be more detailed care that goes into that world. And every single audience member, whether people that pick up on the message or don't pick up on the message or agree or disagree, they're all going to benefit from that granularity and the minutia and, all the resonance that then goes into it. It's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just continuing on WALL-E just a little bit, it also has kind of an anti-metaverse or anti-technology almost aspect to it, right? That the people have forgotten how to do anything now. We've swung from one pendulum to the other almost in WALL-E, right? So that's very interesting. I did want to push back maybe a little bit on one thing you said about the utopia. And of course, I'm thinking about you were saying the utopia, we have to realize it's actually a dystopia. Now I'm fine with that as a normal storytelling thing. I think one of my problems, though, is when it kind of leaks into a certain property everybody all knows, and that would be Star Trek. I get a little frustrated because, you say, oh, well, the Federation is this utopia kind of thing. I wouldn't necessarily define it as a utopia, but I do always find it a problem when they make like the admirals traitors or the president a traitor or something in Star Trek. And that's happened a lot in the movies and some of the TV shows. And I always get frustrated with that because where I see, I always viewed Star Trek, at least back in the day, right, when I was growing up on Next Gen, at least the earlier seasons, right? It's the Federation is this utopia, but you're not there. You are on the fringes, and you're going to get conflict, you're going to get deception, you're going to get problems coming from the new things that you're exploring. And I think that's when the utopia can work, is when we don't necessarily live there. It's backing us up. If we need to go home, we can go there and find it. But but our job is to go out where the utopia doesn't exist and experience those things. And so I kind of get frustrated with some of the newer Star Trek where no, actually the Federation's just a total mess and everybody's a traitor. I get really frustrated with that, because I want to see the external conflict. I want to see that external, where kind of a utopia comes up against the kind of the I don't know, utopia meets dystopia, or utopia meets Skid Row kind of thing. I want to see that, and I want to see how heroes, people with integrity and professional worth ethics and intelligence, can overcome either problems of nature or problems of man versus nature, man versus man, or whatever different conflicts. So that's what I would like to see in Star Trek. But and so that's kind of what I wanted to just a little say. And I'm sure you probably have some thoughts on that, because I know you've probably watched a fair bit of Star Trek.
I mean, my Star Wars side doesn't like me to venture too far into the Star Trek world. I was a big fan of Next Generation back in the day, and I actually loved most of the new Chris Pine films. That was great, and the new show that was on, I've seen a little bit of it. I think it's great, and you're 100% right. And there's a reason why the stories don't take place back on Earth, where the Federation is because, you can establish your utopia somewhere within your story. But your stories need to take place outside that in order to get the conflict. And so if you look at, say, the soapbox or the thematic of Star Trek, it's the value of exploration and how we could continue to push forward to discover new things and never be satisfied with what we know, and let's keep pushing and pushing and pushing. What I would say, if you were to turn Star Trek into a utopia, it's once we explore the entire universe and everything's explored and we found everything, and everything is now pulled into the Federation, and that's it. That would be the utopia that's of that story world, and that would be boring Star Trek. Because if your soapbox is this exploration soapbox, you need to go to those places we haven't explored yet to be able to find that conflict, as you said. So it needs to be on those fringes where we're really kind of pushing the envelope out in the deep. And so you can definitely, so it's a nuanced point, I guess, that I'll backtrack to, because you do raise a good point. Within the whole, the totality of your story world, you can have utopian aspects, but you don't want the whole concept of your story world to be utopia. And I look at the story world of Star Trek, not just to be the Federation, but the whole thing, the whole big bucket of the universe, which obviously hasn't been pulled into that, into that utopian vision yet. So, yeah. It's a good point.
Okay, thank you. No, and thank you for talking about it a bit. Because I don't know. I just it's just something that always kind of just comes up into my mind when I see some different episodes or different shows, and just saying like, what, just asking some fundamental questions about what is it that made us love Star Trek, or what made us love Star Wars. Ask some of those fundamental questions, and it wasn't that admirals were all traitors, right? That's not my answer. That's not my answer when Absolutely I say, why do I love Star Trek?
Absolutely
or,
right.
Or Star, I'm sure there's an analog with Star Wars in there too. It's just like, I didn't, when I love Star Wars, why do I love Star Wars? The answer is because, I knew that, Han Solo had little gold dice hanging in the Millennium Falcon, right? Or what, or where those came from, right? That's not my
100%.
question. That's not my question that I was asking, right?
Absolutely.
I was asking, I was getting other answers, when I asked those questions. But anyway, and as always, we're going, keeping with our theme, we're going long here again today, but maybe we can jump into some building blocks of world building and kind of talk about those quickly. So we've gotten kind of that main thing, the misconception about world building. We've gotten the main, we should have some kind of theme that pulls it in and is going to add layers to our world. What are some of the, like, the nuts and bolts and building blocks that people, need to think about? Should we be like plate tectonics of our world, or what, where does this, where does it end and begin? Because worlds are big, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of world builders really get into this sort of the geology of it and, weather patterns and things like that. Those all could be good, don't get me wrong. But I think there's a few, basic fundamental things we can look at, because I don't want us to fall into what I call world builder's disease, which is, taking so long to build the world that you never actually do anything with it. You don't want to go the full Tolkien. And so you can spend, you can spend years and years and years and years kind of figuring out the plate tectonics of your world, and then never actually have fun with your friends playing the game, or, write the novel, or these other things. So I like to build the world, to about like 70% finished before I then start kind of getting into the storytelling. So a couple quick fundamental tips that I would give is I always like to, once you understand your thematic and the world that needs your soapbox and the world that needs that thematic, really figure out a hook for your world. And a big problem I see with world builders is their inability to boil it down to a single commercial idea. And tell me about your story world. And then it takes them 30 minutes or, a 40-page Google Doc to be able to, to describe what the world is. And I think great worlds can be described in a single line, in what I call a story world log line, or just a hook. We understand log lines for stories, I think, but having a log line for your world is really, really handy, because it really focuses the commercial idea in a good way. And so if you remember Don LaFontaine, he's the trailer guy from back in the 90s. He was in a world.
In a world, yes.
Exactly, right? So if you pretend that you're Don LaFontaine and the trailer guy, you want to do that to your world. In a world where this really interesting thing happens, and see if we can just like lock it into a sentence or two, right? The Purge in a dystopian America where all crime is legal for 24 hours. That is a story with logline. There's lots of complexity that goes on top of that, and there's a lot of nuance that goes into that, and there's a lot of other stuff that we miss. But that's the commercial idea that can be boiled down to a single line. And it's super, super effective. Like Mortal Engines, the great YA series, that was a terrible Peter Jackson film. In a world where cities roll around like tanks on wheels and tracks, right? One line, we have that, we have that idea. Sweet Tooth, in a post-apocalyptic America where children animal hybrids begin to be born. One line, and then we have that whole comic series and TV series just really communicated that commercial idea. And so identify, like, what's the hook of your world? Where's the irony? Where's the cool special sauce thing that this world has, and how can you focus it down on that one line? And if you can't focus it down on a line or two, you haven't really nailed it, or you may not even have one. Right. And so, Neverland, Peter Pan, in a world where, there's an island where you never age and live as a kid forever. Like, boom, that's the idea right there. And so I always encourage world builders, because world builders think so broadly and so granularly. Okay, let's figure out what the hook is. Like, what's that one cool aspect of that world, right? But, in a world where all magic is controlled, or emanates from a singular rock or something. I don't know, like figure out that like that thing that, you know, what, you know, or in a world where, you know, aliens look exactly like people and we don't know who's who, you know, like let's figure out that one hook. And then that really focuses a lot of conflict. And so, and really focuses the different type of storytelling you can have. So I always encourage creators to find that hook and really work on that storyboard logline. And I think one of the most practical things, though, and this is really going to hit well with your RPG crowd, is one thing that is really, really super handy for me is when I'm developing worlds, I create the population of a world thinking in groups rather than characters. And so I don't think about Frodo, I think about hobbits. I don't think about Tony Stark necessarily. I think about the Avengers or superheroes or billionaires, depending on what kind of groups you're operating in. So you want to populate the world based on groups, but here's my tip. So the character alignment chart in D&D, where we know you have those 9 boxes, right? You know, from good to evil to lawful to chaotic. And we always try to find where our character is on that alignment chart. What I like to do is I take the character alignment chart and I call it the group alignment chart. And I go through every single box in that matrix. And so if you put that matrix down from lawful to chaotic to good to evil, there's 9 boxes in that matrix. There, you know, there's lawful good and there's, you know, neutral good and there's chaotic good, et cetera, et cetera. When you populate your world, think of a group, not an individual character, but a group of characters that exist in every single box. And so think about a group that exists in lawful good, and think about a group that is your chaotic good. Think about your group that's your neutral. Maybe those are bounty hunters or mercenaries or, you know, free agents of some sort. What's your chaotic evil group? And maybe, you know, your lawful evil group, and what's your, you know, chaotic neutral group. And when you do that and think and make sure you fill in all 9 boxes with different character groups that exist in this world, all of a sudden you populate your world with 9 different groups, which is pretty cool. But they're all ideologically different because you've assigned them to different boxes. And so it's a natural way to force conflict because now all of a sudden your chaotic good group will have conflict with your evil groups, but they'll also have conflict with your lawful good group because they see the world ideologically different because of their alignment. And so you get the same, it's the same process doing the character alignment. You're just making sure you fill all 9 boxes out with different groups. And what I would suggest, and I know, gosh, this is probably a topic for a whole other podcast, is I wouldn't fill them out necessarily with races. Like, I think that's sort of an interesting, you know, there's one race that's always going to be this persuasion. I wouldn't do that. I'd mark out my races first outside of that alignment chart and then pull groups from every race. And maybe, you know, there's different groups that's an amalgamation of different races, or maybe there's a group within that race that has this persuasion. And I think you kind of get away from some ickiness that, you know, that our, you know, tabletop RPG Twitter is constantly discussing. Yeah. But having a group in all 9 boxes is a really super practical world building tool that can help you populate your world in a really dynamic way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there was a lot there that I can talk about. And so, yeah, a couple of things. The last one first, I think so. I think that creating a group alignment can be a little icky here and there. Yeah. Usually what I would say, you make it a government, right? You say this government is evil, but individuals then can make their own choice, their own moral choices within that. So you say, oh, well, I have this empire over here. That's the evil empire right now. But it doesn't mean all the people in there are evil. It just means that the king and his advisors are evil and they're oppressing people or whatever. And then this one's good, but it doesn't mean, it's all good. It just means that, right now they are looking for the interests of their people or whatever it is, and something like that. I think that's a little bit better framing sometimes in that regard. And then I think your point about the world builder's disease. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Right. This is the trap. This is the trap that role players fall into. It's a trap I think the novelists fall into, or maybe I should say, and I'm not making fun of anybody. This is me. This is me. Amateur novelists or aspiring screenwriters or something like that. This is the trap we fall into because we get this world idea and we're like, I got to finish it. I got to build it out. And nobody's interested in it, right? Like we haven't tested it out to see if people are interested in it. Sure, Tolkien, he can spend 17 years on it, but or even longer,
Right.
but he releases it out into the world in such a way, right, that we instantly connect with Bilbo and Frodo and Sam and some of the other characters. And if he hadn't have done that, it would be an interesting side note in literary history, right? Christopher Tolkien could publish his dad's notebooks and people would be like, oh, wow, that's cool. But, some guy spent his whole lifetime making this thing, but he never published it or anything. And, but it wouldn't have had the impact if he hadn't connected us to that story, like we talked about earlier, right? Where you give us Bilbo, you give us Frodo or Sam, maybe even more in particular, that you hang this, that you hang this story on and you're like, well, I got to know every aspect of this world now. And then to your point about, exactly what to finish what I was saying, right? I mean, you're an aspiring novelist, you're an aspiring screenwriter or something like this. You get into that loop where you just keep creating and creating and creating. And then, frankly, it's going to be decades later and you're going to wake up one day and realize that you just been spinning your wheels on stuff that you haven't really tried to get out there and really do something with. And like I said, I'm not making fun of anybody. I've been there. It's, about 5 years ago, I stopped doing that stuff and I started getting stuff out into the world. And so just to let people know about that. But I think to your point, to leave things unfinished, I think that is really big. I think that is a huge aspect. And I know, kind of along with character creation as well. I remember, years ago when I was the aspiring screenwriter, I was like 19 or 20, I read The Art of Dramatic Writing. It's a famous book. And the author says, know everything about your character, put down every line, put down everything. And so I did that for a while and I couldn't write anything anymore. Right. And then, a few years ago, I watched a video with Aaron Sorkin on YouTube and he's like, don't create everything about your character, because if you do, then you shut off the story. You leave the background of mystery, and then you can weave things in as the dots and things emerge in your world, and you can connect your character into that. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant.
Absolutely right.
Because it's just, you got yourself in a static place then, you know the history of the character, but the story can't evolve or go anyplace, when necessary. So leave that world unfinished, let the details, come in. If you're running a game, let the details of your players' actions and stuff start changing some aspects of that world and weaving it where they go, create pieces around that kind of thing. And then your log line, I mean, I think that is really great, right? Because that way we don't have to finish the world yet, but we can judge people's responses by that log line to see, oh, I got them. I hooked them with the log line. Now I can build out the world because I know they're here, and I like to do that with games, right? I like to do, when I pitch a role-playing game to my players or something, I may say, it's Firefly, but you have superpowers.
Right. Exactly.
Do you want to play that role-playing game?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's Mad Max, but you're all samurais.
Right.
Do you want to play that role-playing game? I do right now. Right. Like,
absolutely. Sure. Sure.
But if I say a log line or some kind of combination, if I say something and people are like, then I know, right? I know that I haven't done it yet. I haven't got the combination that are interesting people. But once I say, hey, Mad Max with samurai, people are like, oh my gosh, I want to play that. Then I can start saying, okay, let's build up some. Why is there an apocalypse? Why are there still samurai? Are they Japanese, or did they just all the other nations of the world or something just adopt the samurai code to try to get some order back into this chaotic world? Who knows, right? And you just start building from there, and you can world build on that once you got some buy-in from some people. I don't know. That's just some of my thoughts about what you were saying.
Absolutely right. And I think that especially when it comes back to the world builder's disease, what you find out is when you click into storytelling mode, you're operating in a different part of your brain,
Yeah.
and the remaining parts of that world will be sussed out through the storytelling, either through the gameplay or through your writing.
Yes.
And it complements what you've done in the world building side of your brain, because you're just operating in a whole different area of your brain. So like you're just going to come up with different ideas or change ideas or find out new opportunities. You can't when you're just in sort of the expository world building form. So I think through this storytelling aspect, you will ultimately be able to finish it. And so you just don't want to have it completely finished before you move into that storytelling. Yeah, I think it's a lot of wisdom there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a prime example, we've been talking about Lord of the Rings a little bit, a prime example, if you read some of the stuff that Christopher Tolkien has published, prime example of that, right, is when Frodo and the hobbits reach the Prancing Pony, right? Tolkien, as an author, realizes that these hobbits are totally ill-equipped to handle and to navigate this world with humans and people who are out to kill them and ring wraiths and stuff. So he needs to give them a guide. So he's going to give them a ranger, and his name is Strider. He's going to give them that guide. But then when you look into your world, or you create into the world, and you say that Ranger Strider is actually Aragorn, the heir of the Númenórean kingdom, right? You're just like, it's a master stroke, right? And it wouldn't have really come about unless he had really started telling the story of Frodo and the ring and how it was going to be, how it was going to go back to Mount Doom, right? Absolutely. If he would have made it up first, right, the heir maybe would have been someplace else. Frodo would have, Frodo wouldn't have been there. Sure. Who knows what would have happened? So, allowing, having the pieces of your world and then drawing that story in the middle, and then having enough flexibility to connect kind of the dots with it, just makes an absolutely engaging story. Sure. And as always, like I said, I'm running you over here. I could talk about movies and role-playing games for like ever, I think. So sure. Absolutely. But, maybe some final thoughts before I ask, where people can find what you're up to nowadays. Maybe some final thoughts on world building just really quick. And then I'll ask you where people can find some of your stuff and learn more about you.
My big suggestion when it comes to world building is, and this speaks, I think well to the role playing community, is you have a world building idea and you're building a world, and especially if you leave it incomplete to some level and then release it to your character or to your players, or if you're a novelist or whatever, give it to people, especially role-playing gamers, and allow those gamers to try to break your world. And don't be defensive about it. Use tabletop role-playing games as an opportunity to focus, not just focus test, but like QC your world, because they're always going to find things that don't work. And so I do that with, like, when I'm working with professionals, is I will tell them, like, as we're developing the world, basically I have them create a source book in game parlance of what this world is. And then I encourage them to give it to a set of role-playing gamers that can put a generic system to it, and then let those gamers play in it, even if they're developing it for TV or a novel, and they don't really have an inclination toward games. Let the role players try to break it, not maliciously, but just like as they operate within how role-playing games go, like, the gamers will naturally break it.
Yes.
And when you find those break
I'm from a different continent. That's what they always do.
Exactly. Right. And they'll find the holes, and they'll find the breaking points. And those are great for you as a world builder. Don't fight it. Don't get defensive about it. Say, okay, cool. I'm so glad you found that, because now you can go and plug that hole in another pass through in your world building. So whether you are a tabletop role-playing game creator, or whether you're a novelist or a filmmaker, I think making sure you push worlds to tabletop role-playing game fanatics at some point will help you be a better world builder, because ultimately they'll find everything that's wrong with it, and that's a good thing to happen.
No, absolutely. I totally agree because, I know we talk about sometimes, the game master or the dungeon master being like this creative force behind the game, but the players of role playing games are as creative, if not more creative than the game master at the table, right? That's why that's why they're playing the games, right? They're bringing their creative, juices to this as well. And they want to, they understand, things about the world that they find interesting and cool. So, it's always, that's one of my big tips for a game master is just like, you're stuck, ask your players what they're doing or where something is. And they're going to spin out this thing, that you couldn't even have imagined because they're thinking about stories and stuff all the time. Anyway. All right. Well, Houston, it's been awesome. Why don't you let people know where they can find you or learn more about you or what you got coming down the pipe?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter primarily. Just search my name. You can get me there. I think Twitter is at Houston_Howard. You can go to my website at superstory.works. Superstory.works, and that's my hub. Also, just launched this new group called Fulcrum World Builders that is all about uniting and pulling together and training world builders that can create sustainable story worlds that can actually make our world a better place, which is something that's still early stage, but it's coming together nicely. So you'll be hearing some stuff moving forward about that. But I put a lot of this content into my latest book, You're Going to Need a Bigger Story, which you can pick up on Amazon or through the website as well. And that's how they can find me.
Absolutely. That's awesome. And I will make sure that there are links to your books and to your website in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So if you are listening right now, you can head over there, find the show notes, and you will be able to find those links very easily to Houston's books and to his website. Well, Houston, it was an awesome pleasure to talk with you about this. Like I said, I could keep going. All that means is that like 6 months down the road, I'm going to have you back on or something like that. And we're just going to have to go crazy again and talk about stories and world building, role-playing games and movies and TV shows. And, and maybe have our big, 3-hour Star Wars rant or something like that. We can finish that at some point too. So
we've gone through this whole time and haven't even talked about Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, I know. Oh yeah. We haven't even, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't been able to watch it yet. So
watch it and then have me back on and we'll talk because that's an interesting one.
Okay. Maybe I know I haven't had a chance. So I haven't been watching too much media about it. So I don't know if people are saying it's good or if it's bad or anything like that. Cause I've been holding off because we've been busy with some other stuff here, but maybe I will try to do that and we can see, we can have another Star Wars rant or something.
Let's do it, brother.
All right. But absolutely. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, man.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right. There you have it, guys. Oh, man. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Houston today. I had a blast talking to him about world building and diving into stories and some of the misconceptions around role-playing games and the worlds that game masters want to create. It was just awesome. So I hope you really enjoyed it as much as I did. Again, if you want to check out Houston and learn more about what he is up to, please visit dicegeeks.com. Find the show notes for this episode, and you will find links to Houston's website and his books and all of the stuff that he is up to. It is great, great stuff. All right. Now, as always, if you want some free stuff, check out dicegeeks.com/free. If you want to find out what's there, just head there and check it out yourself. You will not be disappointed. Also, if you could rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast, that would be awesome. If you want to help the show out financially, patreon.com/dicegeeks. And all your dreams will come true. All right, guys. I thank you so much for listening. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.